4 years ago, Lindsay Hallam published her analysis, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, in the Devil's Advocate series, one of the earliest books to focus specifically on the Twin Peaks film. Today is the 30th anniversary of Fire Walk with Me's US release, and I couldn't think of a better guest to bring on for this subject than Lindsay, whose work on Fire Walk with Me connects it not just to Twin Peaks and David Lynch's other work, but also horror films, films about trauma, the study of affect, and the traditions of the melodramatic genre, particularly 1950s films by directors like Douglas Sirk and Nicholas Ray. More on that in a moment. The melodrama aspect is touched on briefly in Lindsay's book, but fleshed out more deeply in her essay for the Women of Lynch book. We'll be discussing all of that and more in this two-part discussion. The first part here on YouTube for the public, and the second, longer part, available to the $5 a month tier on Patreon, as with all of these Twin Peaks conversations. I interviewed Lindsay back in 2018 when her book was brand new, and I'll link that piece, a written transcription, in the description, along with other pertinent material, so I tried not to cover too much of the same ground this time around. Before we begin, an update on my recent work. Since last month's conversation, my published output has slowed down. I've paused the Lost in Twin Peaks podcast until the fall, and I've picked up the pace behind the scenes, where I'm trying to build a substantial backlog for the first time in months. I did make several entries in my upcoming Twin Peaks character series available to all of my patrons, previewing the 75th through 80th characters on the list, ranked by screen time. Every month I advance 3 entries on Patreon, some entirely new, some revised from older entries in 2017 before Season 3. These are written pieces where I explore the characters' presence in both the new and old material, their narrative arc, what they tell us about Twin Peaks, the actor's background, which is often quite fascinating, and much more, all illustrated with screenshots. I won't reveal the identities of these particular characters since that itself is one of the perks of patronage, so join up to find out. On my public podcast feeds, I continued the classic Hollywood focus on Lost in the Movies this season, with the Howard Hawks directed Cary Grant, Ginger Rogers, Marilyn Monroe comedy Monkey Business, and it continued the Ray's Haunted 50s theme on Twin Peaks Cinema podcast by comparing Nicholas Ray's Rebel Without a Cause to Twin Peaks, particularly the pilot and Fire Walk with Me. The next film in that series, Bigger Than Life, will also come up in tonight's discussion. So on that note, let's welcome Lindsay Hallam. Welcome to Twin Peaks Conversations. So to start off, Lindsay, just introduce yourself to the listeners if they haven't encountered your work yet. I'm sure many have. And what approach your book takes to Fire Walk with Me.
Hi, so it's nice to be back here, although it's kind of taken me back because the book came out, I think, around 2018. So it's been a while. I actually
Yeah.
had to have a quick look at it before this interview to kind of remind myself of what I wrote. So I am by my day job is as a lecturer in film. I'm also the co-course leader of the film degree at the University of East London. So I'm a full-time academic, but thankfully part of that role alongside teaching is research. So my research speciality is horror cinema, but the thing that really got me into it all was Twin Peaks. I discovered it at video library in Australia when I was a teenager and became completely obsessed, and then from there became obsessed with just all of David Lynch's work. But weirdly enough, when I went on to do my PhD and things, I didn't really discuss Lynch's work, and it wasn't really until just before the return, the third season came out, that there was a conference at the Manchester, sorry, at Salford University, where I began writing about Twin Peaks. So I wrote about the second season for that conference, which ended up being a paper that's available online at Senses of Cinema. And then from there, I haven't really looked back. And then that kind of opened the floodgates of me writing about Twin Peaks. So the book is part of the Devil's Advocate series, and the whole idea of the Devil's Advocate series is that it's kind of like what we have here. The BFI have these film classics series, which are these really small books that are devoted to just one film classic. And the idea with the Devil's Advocates is that it's horror classics. So I met the editor of the series, John Atkinson, at another conference, and basically said to him, "How do I write one of these?" And he said, "Send me a book proposal." And this was Fire Walk with Me was one of 4 films that I pitched to him, and we ended up settling up on Firewalk with Me, which is what I was hoping he would go for. And so I had to come up with different chapters for the book. So decided that the main argument of my book would be that it's a horror film because the series focuses on horror films. And I saw that as a real departure from the series, which had more of those soap opera, police procedural, film noir elements to it. And I think the film is very much a horror film. It is a really horrific film, and part of that is because you are with Laura Palmer. And I think really to really understand what she's going through and her experience, the horror genre actually is the most appropriate genre to really delve in and really put you as the viewer with her and with her experience. So that was the main argument of the book was just how is this a horror film? But then I have other chapters where I talk about, it's also how does it fit as a Twin Peaks film? Because of course, when it first came out, people didn't like it. And then I also looked much more at the representation of trauma in the film. Also connected the film to other Lynch films because, as most people I'm sure listening know, that Mark Frost, the co-creator of Twin Peaks, wasn't involved in the film. And what else did I do? Oh, and then I looked at situated the film within the other what I called paratexts, which are kind of parallel texts, like some of the extras that came with the Blu-ray release, the entire mystery Blu-ray release that came out around 2014, and also the new season because that just came out as I was writing the book. And then I also looked at the influence of Firewalk with Me on other more recent horror films. So that really took me to 40,000 words, which was the limit that I was given, and it was surprising that there was still heaps of things that I would have loved to have explored. But yeah, so that's what the film, sorry, that's what the book was all about.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the structure of it. We talked about that at that time, how you found different areas to kind of focus on one aspect. I think of it as kind of a prismatic film. And coincidentally, I mentioned this in the first interview, but it's worth mentioning again because it kind of fascinates me that we were on these parallel tracks. I
Mm,
was writing this big essay at the time, which also looked at Fire Walking Me through four lenses, and three of the four were the same, Lynch film, Twin Peaks film, horror film, and then the other one was art film. But I noticed that the art films I was looking at were all about women who had usually some sort of trauma that they were
mm.
dealing with. So it was like, that interesting parallel. But another thing that you kind of touch upon in the book, and then you've explored more in later work as well. And we'll get into that probably more in the back part of this conversation. But I wanted to just bring it in a little bit now. Is melodrama? I think specifically like post-war Hollywood melodramas and how that also relates to Fire Walk with Me. I think if I recall correctly, you sort of allude to this in the book and have maybe a few pages or even paragraphs on it, but you didn't at that time have a whole section on it. And then in some of your later work, you explore that a little more.
Yeah, because I think, well, the focus of the book, like I said, was that it's a horror film.
Right.
And I think the melodrama influence is something that I see across uh, Lynch's work, and maybe more so in the series than in the film. Although one of the things that I really wanted to get into in the book, which was one of the things I didn't have space for, was I think it was around the time or not long before I started writing the book. I saw Nicholas Ray's film Bigger Than Life, and I just felt like that is there's so many uh, commonalities between Bigger Than Life and Firewalk with Me, in particular in relation to Leland Palmer. And because in Nicholas Ray's film Bigger Than Life, you've got James Mason, who is this father. He has a wife and a young son, and he ends up he ends up becoming ill, and he's put on this medication, and it basically makes him psychotic. And there were just scenes in Bigger Than Life that remind me so much of scenes with Leland. Like there's a scene at the dinner table in Bigger Than Life where James Mason's character is basically terrorizing his wife and his son because there's a uh, a jug of milk, and the wife had given the son some milk before dinner, and then James Mason is just incensed by why did you give him some milk before his dinner, and wants to measure the jug and see, how much, to kind of prove that his wife and son have done this like betrayal of drinking this milk. And it reminds me so much of the scene with the dirt under the fingernails. So it just there was just that film, it just seemed like there's so many kind of parallels. I don't know if Lynch even saw the film, or if he was aware of it. I know that he had watched Peyton Place and hated it. Um, but it just seems like just that whole 50s Americana, but also the I guess the darkness or the other side of that perfect veneer. I think melodrama films, unlike the Douglas Sirk melodramas, are all about everything looks beautiful, but actually there's the people are suffering underneath
Yeah, and
underneath that facade.
it would be interesting to sort of trace I guess, the genealogy in a way of how that, I think, directly through Peyton Place, among other
Mm.
aspects, kind of fed into the TV soap opera and then Twin Peaks. And then you could almost say Fire Walk with Me is like tapping into it through sort of another strain, through sort of back to the kind of big screen, larger than life roots of melodrama. Well, I mean, you could trace it back further than that, obviously, in fiction and all of that. But in terms of its audiovisual presentation, back to the kind of cinematic version of that. And as I said, I think that we'll sort of dig into that more as we talk with Lynch's films in general as well. But it's funny. Another sort of coincidence about this timing is I'm actually doing a series on my Twin Peaks Cinema podcast now of Nicholas Ray's films called Ray's Haunted 50s, where I'm comparing On Dangerous Ground, Rebel Without a Cause to Twin Peaks. And next month's film will be Bigger Than Life. So,
Oh.
and it was funny when I watched it, I was on a family trip with sister and parents and all, all of that. And they my I think it was, I want to say my mother and my father, maybe both of them, happened to be sort of watching as I watched this film, watching a part of it. And my mother noticed, oh, I know who that actor is. One of the little boys painting. In fact, it's the boy painting a sort of demented picture of his mother as like a monster or something, which is an interesting touch. Do you know the scene I'm talking about? It's like an art class or something.
I have vague recollection. It's been a few years since I've watched the film.
So the funny thing is, that's the kid from that's Beaver from Leave It to Beaver. So
Oh.
you see this kind of wholesome 50s icon right there in the middle of this darker version of the 50s, painting a dark picture of his mother. I just thought that was hilarious. I mean, obviously, I don't think Leave It to Beaver had even been put on the air yet at that point, but total coincidence. But I that tickled me.
Wow. See, I wouldn't have got that because
I
I didn't
wouldn't have
grow up.
either. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I needed the boomers to point it out to me. So, as we talk about when this book came out, now it was 4 years ago. And I think one of the running themes of these conversations I've been having, they started late 2021, and every month I've been talking to authors of Twin Peaks book. And often, sometimes they're new books, sometimes they're, from that period right around the return, like yours is. And sometimes they originated then and they were kind of finally published now. And uh, I find it fascinating how we're at a point now where there's been quite a bit of time since the return and since that flush of kind of mid-teens, say 2014 to 2017, 18, um, new kind of development of a Twin Peaks fandom, I think, where a lot of new people came into it. A lot of people who've been into it for a while started writing or commenting on it. All these podcasts and books popped up. And I was wondering where both you personally with your book and I guess the broader kind of community that was grown up around Twin Peaks in that time. Where you kind of feel that they are at this point now with the show, the new show also kind of being in the past, and how you would maybe compare that to earlier eras of a Twin Peaks scholarship and fandom and all of that. And I guess the two blur together quite a bit.
Mm. Well, it's funny. When I went to that conference, it would have been 2015. So, and everyone, so that conference, I think, was in to celebrate 25 years since
Mm,
the original series, and we all knew at that conference that the new season was coming.
hmm.
And also around that time, there was an anthology. It's called Return to Twin Peaks, that I think it was edited by Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock and Catherine Spooner. I'm looking at it right now on my shelf, and that had come out. And so some of the people that were doing papers were doing papers at the conference that were based on their chapters in this Return to Twin Peaks book. And it was funny because one of the keynote speakers at that conference was is it David Lavery,
Mm,
who of course edited the Full of Secrets, which I think would that have been the first
yes.
book?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was actually the book that got me really back into Twin Peaks in 2014 before I knew about the missing pieces and or even the
Mm.
season 3 announcement. I just happened to have that book. I hadn't read it yet. I was sitting by my bookshelf and I thought, "Oh, finally, I haven't watched Twin Peaks in years. I'll finally read this." And it that was really the catalyst for really where I am now because I haven't kind of left haven't left that universe for the past 8 years or so, but yeah. And he
Well,
passed away around this time too, right? Shortly
yeah, well,
before the return.
yeah, it was just a couple of years or so after that conference that he unfortunately passed away. And it was funny because he was there and he did his keynote speech. And in that speech, he actually talked about how he just rewatched Firewalk with me and how terrible it was and how terrible Cheryl Lee was. And I was like, what?
Wow, that's shocking.
But yes, but he did say a lovely thing at one point where he was saying he was kind of talking about how that there was this new generation of scholars who were there at the conference who were writing about Twin Peaks, and he kind of taught. I think he called us like Twin Peaks 2.0 or something, that we were this next generation of scholars who were looking at Twin Peaks, which was really nice. And yeah, a lot of us. I mean, I was too young to watch the series when it first aired, but I found it a few years after it had been on television. At just yeah, like I said, at the video library. So at that time, no one was talking about it. No one knew about it. No other people I knew um, were watching it. And I have vague recollections though as a child of the Who Killed Laura Palmer. And I remember that it being on the news when it was when you found out that it was Leland. And so when I came to watch the show, I knew who the killer
Oh,
was because I
yeah.
somehow for some reason remembered that that being said like on the radio or something. Um, so yeah, I think there was this flourishing of books and articles and things just before, well, to do with the 25th anniversary of the series, but also in anticipation of the new season. And then of course when the new season came out, that led to a whole new batch of things, and my book kind of came out in that wake. When I was writing the book the summer when the return was on, so it was like my summer of Twin Peaks. It was
Mhm.
wonderful to immerse myself in everything at that time. And and yeah, and since then, yeah, I mean, maybe it's kind of dropped off. I mean, we've got Scott Ryan's fantastic book that's just come out at the moment, and I think obviously with the 30th anniversary coming up, I'm sure we're going to get lots of articles and things that are going to come out of it. But maybe it seems to have settled down.
It
I'm just
feels
trying
like
to
it's
think.
sort of leveled off in a way. Like it has
Yeah.
certainly not dropped to the level it was at even a couple years after the show originally aired. Like then it kind of
Yeah.
crashed and burned, and you had a small devoted group basically clustered around, I would say, Wrapped in Plastic and the Twin Peaks Fest.
Mm.
And not much else. A few websites started to pop up in the early days of the internet, but it was very diminished. And I think what you have after the return is a much more steady, kind of sturdy fandom. But it does seem like the growth aspect has sort of fallen off, where there was that period of sort of tumult where all this new stuff came up. And I think one of the things that is very interesting that you cite that comment by Lavery, which
Mm,
again is surprising because that book of essays had so many great analyses of Firewalk with Me and even sort of critiques of why it was dismissed. So I guess credit to him
mm,
as an editor for getting all that stuff in there, even though despite his own perspective on it. But yeah, it's interesting because I do feel as late as then, and maybe with I think by the time of the return, there was already kind of a critical mass consensus that had turned more towards Firewalk with Me actually being
mm,
something good and something um, that was, more of an apex of the series than kind of a side note or even something you would want to push aside. But really, up to that point, I think I didn't notice a real shift. There were sort of subtle ones, but until the missing pieces, when it
mm,
seemed like then you just started to have more of like a push and pull between Firewalk with Me, forget about it, and no, Firewalk with Me is like the heart of Twin Peaks. And so I think your book was sort of a part of that and coming out of that process of people reevaluating the film. And like I said, there was only two books on Firewalk with Me at that point. And the other one I think was like 6 months before yours or something. So it
mm.
was like really it was a very neglected corner of Twin Peaks for so long. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear you talk just a little bit about that and from that perspective now, where it seems like, knock on wood, that really Firewalk with Me's place in the firmament has, I think, you'll still find plenty of people who don't like it or aren't aware of um, the importance some people see in it. But I do think there's been a major tectonic shift in that film's reputation at this point. I mean, it was in the Criterion Collection.
And I think
What more can you say?
that was a big thing. I think the Criterion Collection, that picking it up was definitely a statement that that perception had changed. I think also because yeah, the 25th anniversary, so that would have been 5 years ago.
Yeah.
I think that it being 25 years since the film had come out. And you've got over here in the UK, we've got the film critic Mark Kermode. I don't know if you're
Yeah.
familiar with him. Yeah, he's like the biggest film critic here. And he has championed Firewalk with Me for years. And in 2012, he did this uh, video blog for like it's on YouTube. I'm sure you can find it on YouTube, where he talks about uh, yeah, Firewalk with Me, and he 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 also situated it in that video blog that it's a horror film. And I think that was also people started to mention it more as a horror film, and I think that also started to shift perceptions of it. As once people started thinking
Mm,
of it as a horror film, I think people maybe got it more, or that the horror fandom found it and they kind of claimed it as well. But that seemed to also to be part of the shift in perception and the reevaluation of the film. I think yeah, definitely Criterion, but also maybe just this shift in thinking of what the film was and how to think of it.
So one of the things you write about in your book, as you mentioned, is this idea of Fire Walk with Me as trauma cinema, which I think certainly overlaps with horror cinema in some ways, but is
Mm.
a distinct phenomenon. And you use this idea of affect, which again we discussed in the interview, but I think we can touch on it again here. This idea of a sort of analyzing a film, even from a scholarly perspective, almost more from a visceral standpoint than just a totally cerebral one. But I'll let you kind of expand on that idea since that's your specialty.
Yeah, so it's there. I mean, especially within the area of horror cinema analysis, for decades, the predominant way of analyzing a horror film was from psychoanalysis, a psychoanalytical point of view. And in the past couple of decades, there's been what people have sometimes referred to as the effective turn, that not so much about what a film means, but how it makes you feel. And so the idea of a film being almost like this, yeah, this bodily event that you experience on a visceral level. So you feel it, and then it's almost like there's this first level of reception, which is just your feeling, and then you start to process it and analyze it and think about it and interpret it. And so it's interesting that affect is almost like trying to put into words something that's before and beyond language. um, but I think that's one of the things that's so uh, I guess I guess was one of the things that's so effective with an E about Fire Walk with Me is that deep visceral response that you get, and also that with trauma, that's something that also it's something it's happening too soon. You can't process it. You're just kind of feeling it, and your brain almost can't comprehend something that's as it's happening because it's too traumatic. So in some ways, affected trauma um, kind of go hand in hand, or there's there's some similarities between them in terms of how you think about them and also how you represent trauma on screen. That I think Janet Walker, who I cite, she wrote this book called Trauma Cinema, and she analyzes mostly like dramas, realist dramas, and things like that. And she kind of talks about how horror and science fiction genre films are kind of outside of her study, but then she talks about this idea of the traumatic paradox, that after you experience trauma, your memory keeps going back to that traumatic event. It's kind of this kind of compulsive return to that trauma, but often you experience or re-experience the trauma not in the way that it actually occurred. That elements of fantasy and things kind of start to intrude into the way you're reconstructing the trauma. So a lot of what Laura Palmer is going through, the fact that she doesn't see her father, she sees this other figure, Bob. Also, this connection to this other realm is in many ways more faithful to the experience of trauma than just a more stereotypically realistic depiction.
It's
So
striking. It
yeah.
was striking as well how Cheryl Lee, her performance, it was not like a deeply like technical performance. It was a
Mm,
real full on. I don't think you would say method necessarily in the
mm,
strict sense of the term, but certainly that type of thing where you're feeling the emotions, you're living the character. And she talked about how she would go back to her hotel room and Laura would
mm,
still be there and all of that. Um, it, it's interesting to look at that in relation to the film, and it's like, you don't want to get carried away. Obviously she was, Laura was somebody who was experiencing incest and had all of this forced on her. Cheryl Lee was a, you know 20 something actress who chose to do
mm.
this part and sort of carefully managed it with her director, but still in some ways it was a traumatic experience for her drawing on that and embodying that as she did. So, and she's written about that, I feel, quite
Mm.
poetically over the years, where she's written poems and things about how Laura sort of lingers with her and haunts her in that way.
And
um
she often talks about that. Yeah, that I guess just acting in general, the
yeah,
whole thing of your body when you're crying or you're acting out a certain event or a scene, your body doesn't know that you're
yeah.
acting, so your body isn't making that differentiation. So yeah, she in some ways is experiencing it. And I know the cinematographer Ron
Mm.
Garcia, in an interview, he was saying that there were, especially the murder scene and the looking in the mirror, that he started to get concerned that she was going way too deep. But I mean, it's one of the greatest. I'm gonna, you know be get all the hyperbole out of the way and say yes, it is one of the greatest performances of all time, I think.
Yeah, I agree totally.
Yeah.
Certainly one of the most, affecting, to use the word.
Mm,
And it strikes me too that and as we talk more about other Lynch films, we'll tie this in more. But Inland Empire to me seems, I don't know consciously or not, but at least subconsciously, it seems to be Lynch in some ways um, uh, expressing that experience because it is this actress who loses herself in the
Mm,
role and is sort of fragmenting and become taking on these different identities and just getting lost. Like you could almost parallel
mm,
that scene at the end of Laura Dern dying on Hollywood Boulevard, and then the slow pull back to the camera of like Cheryl Lee in the cabin on that set screaming, and then the slow pull out
mm.
of the camera and Lynch watching and saying cut. Like you can almost imagine the exact same sort of process to, and her kind of wandering off in a daze. Certainly the people who were there witnessing it kind of describe it that way, you know. It's like
Mm.
it's amazing to think about, but yeah.
I've never thought of that. That's amazing. Yeah, definitely. But also, I guess that with Inland Empire, it ends up being that fracturing. It ends up being a freeing process
Yes.
and the transcendence, which I get is very similar to the ending of Firewalk with Me.
Yes, I agree. And actually that's the point I want to kind of get into in the back half as we explore the melodrama and Lynch's other works as well. So before we get to that, since this will be where the public part of the discussion ends, just tell the listeners where they can find you, your other work, and all of that.
Well, I'm pretty sure the Firewalk with Me book is still available and out there. You can find it online, and yeah, it's the Devil's Advocate series. I think they've now been appropriated by Liverpool University Press. So if you just look up for that press online, you can probably find the book. You can find me online on social media. On Twitter, I'm at Lindsay Hallam one. Although I'm really bad at Twitter, I need to be better at Twitter. I need to be on there more.
Well, maybe
I'm
that's
more.
being maybe that is being good at Twitter.
Yeah, I'm more on Instagram
Yeah.
at the horrible Dr. Hallam, and I always post on there. If something I'm doing is coming out, then I'll post about it there. I've been doing a lot of things for Blu-ray releases recently and
Oh,
getting into
cool.
doing commentaries. So if people, speaking of trauma and horror, if anyone's into the French horror film Martyrs, I did a commentary for a new amazing box set of that's coming out through Umbrella Entertainment. I also did I've got a video essay that's coming up. This
Oh, nice.
Italian Gothic horror box set. Um, yeah. So, but yeah, if you just find me on social media, I always post to things that I've done that are coming out, and or if I do something that's online that people can read.
Great. And those links will all be in the show notes, the description for this as well. And I'll have on the screen to, click below for Devil's Advocate book to
Mm.
start with. And one other book that you contributed to over the past few years was The Women of Lynch, where you talk about the melodrama aspect of Lynch. And that's what I want to start digging into now. So, and we're going to stop there for the public section of this conversation, but head over to Patreon for the rest of this, where we go even deeper into season 3, a lot into melodrama and the connections there with Lynch, with Twin Peaks. This was a topic I found really fascinating, both because of my own recent work where I covered films King's Row and Peyton Place and Our Town on my Twin Peaks Cinema podcast, and also the recent Nicholas Ray ones. And also because some of that interest in covering those films came from Lindsay herself initially. When we first spoke, she mentioned some really fascinating connections between all of those works and Twin Peaks and Lynch. So there's all of that. There's also more, of course, on Fire Walk with Me itself and why it's such an important film. And you can check all of that out on patreon.com/lost in the movies, and make sure you also go below and purchase Lindsay's book, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me with the Devil's Advocate series. All of that in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you on the other side.